Between 1847 and 1849, somewhere in the western counties of Virginia, a young enslaved man named James Rutledge vanished from plantation records with disturbing precision. His name appeared in inventory lists dated March 1847, valued at $1,200, as a skilled blacksmith's apprentice. By November 1849, that same name had been carefully erased from ledgers, replaced with a single notation in faded ink, disposed of by arrangement, medical necessity. 3 separate county physicians signed affidavit during those years, confirming they had performed corrective procedures on plantation properties, but the patient names were redacted. Local church records from the period show an unusual spike in confessions related to sins of the flesh and ungodly temptations among the planter class. For over a century and 70 years, the truth about what happened to James Rutledge remained buried in private family archives, protected by descendants who understood that some family secrets carry a weight too terrible to expose. Tonight we reveal the full account of how desire, jealousy, and absolute power converge to destroy a young man's life in the most intimate and irreversible way possible. Before we continue with the story of James Rutledge and the household that consumed him, take a moment to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. These forgotten American tragedies need to be remembered, and your engagement helps preserve these dark chapters of our history. The story of James Rutledge begins not with his suffering, but with the illusion of mercy that would make his destruction all the more devastating. Greenfield County, Virginia, in the spring of 1847, bore all the hallmarks of prosperity. Built on the backs of human cattle, the rolling hills stretched green and fertile, dotted with tobacco fields that had enriched families for 3 generations. The county seat, Harrington's Ford, consisted of a courthouse, 3 churches, a dozen merchant establishments, and enough lawyers to service the constant legal maneuvering required to maintain the peculiar institution that defined the region's economy. The Sutherland Plantation, known locally as Belmont Hall, commanded 400 acres along the Onofre River. The main house, a Georgian-style mansion with white columns and broad verandas, stood as a monument to accumulated wealth. 57 enslaved people worked the property, their quarters arranged in neat rows behind the main house, far enough to maintain the fiction of separate worlds, close enough to be summoned at any hour. Marcus Sutherland had inherited the estate from his father in 1840 at the age of 32. He was known throughout the county as a modern planter, advocating at local assemblies for what he called enlightened management of enslaved populations. He opposed the most brutal overseers, argued that adequate food and shelter improved productivity, and made a public show of his slaves' relatively good health. His reputation as a humane master earned him respect among moderates and contempt from hardliners who saw such attitudes as dangerous weakness. His wife Arabella Sutherland, née Fairchild, had married into the family in 1842. 20 years younger than her husband, she came from a declining Charleston family that traded its daughters considerable beauty and accomplishments for the security of Virginia wealth. She played piano with genuine skill, spoke adequate French, and managed the household with an efficiency that impressed even her husband's exacting mother before the old woman's death in 1845. By all appearances, the Sutherlands maintained the kind of refined plantation life celebrated in the South Zone mythology. Dinner parties featured elaborate meals served by well-dressed house slaves. The gardens bloomed with imported roses. Guest rooms accommodated visiting relatives and business associates from Richmond and beyond. But beneath this carefully maintained surface, tensions simmered with the intensity of Virginia's humid summers. Marcus Sutherland, for all his public advocacy of humane treatment, had grown increasingly absent from his wife's bed, whether due to declining health, the pressures of managing a large estate, or simple loss of interest. He spent most evenings in his study, reviewing ledgers and corresponding with factors in Richmond. Arabella, barely 25 years old in 1847, found herself trapped in a marriage that had become more commercial arrangement than romantic partnership. The enslaved population of Belmont Hall included the usual mix of field hands, skilled craftsmen, and domestic servants. Among them was a young man who would become the central figure in a tragedy that would expose the rot beneath Greenfield County's civilized veneer. James Rutledge had been born on the property in 1829. The son of Rachel Rutledge, a seamstress who worked in the main house, his father's identity remained officially unknown, though everyone on the plantation understood he had been sired by Marcus Sutherland's younger brother during a visit in 1828. This connection granted James certain advantages, dangerous as such privileges could be. Unlike most enslaved children who were sent to the fields at age 7 or 8, James had been apprenticed to Jacob Thornhill, the plantation's blacksmith, when he turned 12. For 6 years, He learned to shape iron, repair tools, and fabricate the endless metal implements required by plantation operations. By 18, his skill had grown remarkable. His hands, though marked by small scars from forge work, moved with precision when shaping hot iron. His frame had developed the muscular build common to blacksmiths, his shoulders broad, his arms powerful from hours at the anvil. But it was not his skill that would seal his fate. It was his face. James had inherited features that drew eyes wherever he went. High cheekbones, clear brown eyes, a jawline that suggested strength without brutality. His mixed heritage showed in subtle ways that the plantation's white inhabitants found both fascinating and threatening. He moved with unconscious grace, carried himself with a quiet dignity that some interpreted as pride, others as proper bearing befitting his craft. In March of 1847, a series of events began that would transform lives and destroy futures. The plantation's main forge required expansion. Jacob Thornhill, now in his 60s and suffering from the lung ailments common to longtime blacksmiths, needed help with the heavier construction work. Marcus Sutherland, reviewing the project plans, made a decision that would prove catastrophic. James was temporarily reassigned from forge work to assist with carpentry repairs on the main house. The east wing needed window frames replaced, door hinges repaired, various metalwork updated. The job would take several weeks, requiring James to work in close proximity to the family's daily life. Arabella Southerners noticed him on a Tuesday morning in late March. She had been arranging flowers in the front parlor when movement outside the window caught her attention. James stood on a ladder, carefully removing an old window frame, his shirt sleeves rolled up, concentration evident on his face. She watched for perhaps 30 seconds before catching herself and turning away, disturbed by the sudden quickening of her pulse. Over the following days, she found excuses to be near wherever James was working. She would sit reading in rooms where he repaired fixtures, claiming the light was better there. She would pass through hallways where he installed new hinges, nodding politely, saying nothing. She began to time her movements through the house to coincide with his work schedule. James, for his part, remained scrupulously professional. He kept his eyes on his work, spoke only when spoken to, maintained the careful distance that survival demanded. He understood the danger of any interaction that might be misinterpreted. He had seen men whipped for the sin of existing in sight of white women in moments those women found inconvenient, but Arabella's interest was not casual, and it was not fleeting. By April, Arabella had moved from observation to conversation. She began asking James questions about his work, about the forge, about techniques for shaping iron. The questions gave her an excuse to stand near him, to watch his hands as he demonstrated, to lean close enough to catch the smell of forge smoke and honest sweat that clung to his clothes. James answered carefully, keeping his responses brief and respectful. He called her Miss Arabella as was required, kept his eyes lowered when speaking, tried to make himself smaller in her presence. Other slaves noticed. Sarah, who managed the house staff, pulled James aside one evening after he'd returned to his quarters. "You mind yourself around the mistress," she said quietly, her voice tight with worry. "That kind of attention brings nothing but trouble." "I'm just doing my work," James replied, but his tone carried uncertainty. "Your work don't require her standing that close." Sarah said, "Don't matter what you do or don't do. If she decides she wants something, you can't say no, and if the master finds out, you're the one who pays. Keep your head down and finish that job quick as you can." James tried. He worked faster, attempting to complete repairs ahead of schedule. He began arriving earlier and leaving later, hoping to avoid times when Arabella might be present. But a plantation house is not large enough to avoid someone who wants to find you. In early May, Marcus Sutherland departed for Richmond on business related to tobacco contracts. The trip would keep him away for 10 days. The morning after his departure, Arabella summoned James to her private sitting room on the second floor. He stood in the doorway, tools in hand, waiting for instruction about what needed repair. The room was decorated in soft blues and creams, furniture imported from Philadelphia, a writing desk near the window. Arabella sat in a chair near the fireplace, though no fire burned on the warm spring day. "Close the door," she said. James hesitated. "Miss Arabella, it wouldn't be proper." I said, "Close the door." He complied, his heart hammering. He remained standing near the door, tools still in hand like a shield. "Put those down," Arabella said. Her voice had changed, taken on a quality that made his skin prickle. "Come here, ma'am. If something needs fixing, I should come here." James crossed the room slowly, stopping several feet from her chair. Arabella stood, closing the distance between them. She reached out and touched his chest, her palm flat against the worn fabric of his work shirt. "You're very strong," she said softly. "I've watched you work. You move like you could lift the world if you chose to." "Miss Arabella, the saint isn't," she corrected, her hand still on his chest. "You're educated enough to speak properly. Jacob told me you read that you figure numbers in your head better than most white men." Her other hand came up to touch his face. "You're extraordinary. Do you know that?" James stood frozen, terror and confusion warring in his mind. He understood with perfect clarity that he was trapped. If he pushed her away, she could claim assault. If he fled, she could summon overseers. If he complied, he would be equally destroyed when Marcus Sutherland inevitably discovered the truth. "Please," he whispered, "don't do this." Arabella's smile faded. Her hands fell away. For a moment, James thought she might relent, might recognize the impossible position she'd created. Instead, her expression hardened. "Go," she said coldly. "Get out." James gathered his tools and left, his hand shaking so badly he nearly dropped a hammer on the stairs. That evening, he went to Jacob Thornhill's cabin. The old blacksmith listened to the story, his weathered face growing increasingly troubled. "You can't refuse her," Jacob said finally, "but you can't comply either. There's no good choice here, son. What do I do? We go to Master Marcus when he returns. We tell him the truth before she can tell lies." Jacob shook his head. "It might not save you, but it's the only chance you got." For 3 days, James tried to make himself invisible. He worked in the forge, took meals in his quarters, avoided the main house. But on the 4th day, Arabella sent for him again. This time she was different, controlled, almost businesslike. "I've been thinking," she said. They were in the same sitting room, but now the door stood open and Sarah worked in the hallway within earshot. "I may have been hasty the other day. I want to apologize." James said nothing, watching her carefully. "You're a skilled worker," Arabella continued. "Marcus thinks highly of your abilities. I was merely curious about your training, and I fear I expressed that curiosity inappropriately." She smiled, and it looked almost genuine. "Can we forget that unpleasant encounter? I'd hate for there to be awkwardness between us." "Yes, ma'am." James said carefully. "We can forget it." "Good." She gestured toward a chair near the window. "The arm is loose. If you could tighten it, I would appreciate it." James examined the chair. The repair required perhaps 5 minutes. As he worked, Arabella sat at her writing desk, apparently absorbed in correspondence. When he finished, he gathered his tools. "James," she said as he reached the door. Her voice was soft again, intimate. "I do appreciate your discretion. A lady's reputation is such a fragile thing. One misunderstood moment, one malicious rumor, and everything can be destroyed." She met his eyes. "I'm glad we understand each other." The threat was clear. She had framed the incident in a way that made him complicit, transformed what could have been his potential defense into evidence of conspiracy. If he told anyone, she would claim he had initiated the contact, that he had forced his way into her room, that only her pleading had prevented something terrible. James left the main house with a weight of dread settling in his chest. He had been outmaneuvered before he'd even realized he was in a game. Marcus Sutherland returned from Richmond on a Thursday in mid-May. The tobacco contracts had been favorable, and he arrived in good spirits, already planning expansion of the plantation's operations. That evening at dinner, Arabella was attentive and charming, discussing household matters and local news with her usual grace. But over the following weeks, the atmosphere at Belmont Hall began to shift in ways too subtle for Marcus to immediately notice, but obvious to those who lived in the shadows. Arabella's behavior toward James changed again. She no longer sought him out privately, no longer made inappropriate advances. Instead, she began a campaign of casual cruelty, disguised as innocent requests. She would summon him to repair items that weren't broken, then express disappointment that he wasted time on unnecessary work. She would praise his craftsmanship to Marcus in ways that emphasized James's physical qualities. Watching her husband's face for reactions, she engineered situations where James would be working near her when Marcus was present, creating tableau of innocent domesticity that nonetheless carried suggestions of impropriety to minds primed to see it. James tried to navigate this minefield with desperate care. He worked quickly, spoke little, kept his eyes down. But Arabella was playing a longer game than he understood. In June, she began to confide in certain ladies of the county during afternoon visits. Nothing explicit, just small comments that accumulated weight through repetition, a concern about the boldness of some enslaved workers, a worry about the safety of plantation mistresses when their husbands traveled. a mention of how one particular slave seemed to have ideas above his station. The rumors spread quietly through the network of white women who socialized over tea and needlework. James Rutledge's name began to circulate, always accompanied by meaningful looks and lowered voices. Marcus heard whispers at the county courthouse, at church, and conversations with neighboring planters. Nothing concrete, no direct accusations, just a growing sense that something unseemly might be occurring under his own roof. He began to watch. He noticed how Arabella would stiffen slightly when James entered a room to perform repairs. He saw how James would not meet anyone's eyes, how he moved through the house like a man walking on broken glass. Marcus interpreted these observations through the lens his wife had carefully ground. Seeing guilt where there was only terror, seeing conspiracy where there was only survival instinct. In July, Arabella made her move. She came to Marcus in his study late one evening, her face pale, hands trembling. She sat in the chair across from his desk and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I should have told you weeks ago, but I was frightened." Ashamed, Marcus set down his pen. "What's happened?" "James Rutledge," she said, and her voice broke convincingly. "The blacksmith's apprentice. He has been inappropriate with me." Marcus felt his blood run cold. "Explain." Arabella told a story carefully constructed from fragments of truth twisted into lies. Yes, James had been in her sitting room, but he had cornered her there, speaking to her with familiarity that terrified her. Yes, she had touched his chest, but only to push him away when he'd stepped too close. Yes, there had been multiple encounters, but only because she'd been too frightened to tell anyone, worried that Marcus wouldn't believe her, that the community would blame her for somehow encouraging a slave's attention. "Why didn't you tell me immediately?" Marcus demanded. "Because I was afraid you'd kill him," Arabella said, tears now streaming down her face. "And then there would be questions, investigations. People would wonder what had really happened. My reputation would be destroyed, even if you were justified. I thought I could manage it, could avoid him. But he finds excuses to be near me. He watches me, Marcus. When you're not here, he watches me." Marcus Sutherland sat in silence for a long moment. Everything he'd observed over recent weeks suddenly reconfigured itself into his wife's narrative. The way James moved through the house, the whispers from other planters' wives, the subtle tensions he'd sensed without understanding. "I'll take care of this," he said finally, his voice flat and cold. Arabella reached across the desk and gripped his hand. "Please, don't do anything that will bring scandal. We have to live here. Our reputation matters." I said, "I'll take care of it." That night, Marcus Sutherland sat alone in his study until dawn, a bottle of bourbon slowly emptying, his mind working through options and consequences. By morning, he had decided on a course of action that would protect his wife's honor, maintain his reputation as a humane master, and ensure that James Rutledge would never threaten any white woman again. The following day, Marcus summoned Jacob Thornyhill to the main house. The old blacksmith arrived with his hat in his hands, his face creased with worry. He'd seen James's fear growing over recent weeks, had known something terrible was building, but he'd hoped his years of faithful service might grant him the influence to diffuse whatever crisis was approaching. "I need to speak with you about your apprentice," Marcus said without preamble. They stood in his office, the door closed, the morning sun cutting harsh angles through the window. "James is a good worker, sir," Jacob began. "Best I've trained, honest, hard-working." "I've received troubling reports," Marcus interrupted, "about his conduct around Mrs. Elteround, Sutherland." Jacob's heart sank. "Sir, James wouldn't. Are you calling my wife a liar?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Jacob understood with terrible clarity that there was no defense he could offer that wouldn't make things worse. "No, sir," he said quietly. "I ain't saying that. James has been living in your household," Marcus continued. "You've had oversight of his character and development. This reflects poorly on your judgment. He's a good boy, Mr. Marcus. He keeps to himself, does his work, don't cause no trouble. Apparently, he's been causing a great deal of trouble. The kind that destroys reputations and families." Marcus moved to the window, looking out at the grounds. "I could sell him south. That's what most men would do, but I've spent considerable resources training him, and he has valuable skills. Moreover, I have a responsibility to ensure he never threatens another woman in this manner again." Jacob waited, dread building in his chest. "I've been consulting with certain medical men in Richmond," Marcus said. "There's a procedure. It's been used historically for various purposes. It removes the appetites that lead men into wickedness, the physical urges that cause them to transgress against proper order." Understanding crashed over Jacob like cold water. "Mr. Marcus, please don't do this to that boy. It's already decided. Dr. Cornelius Ashby from Richmond will arrive next week. He's performed this operation before. He assures me it can be done safely, that James will recover and return to work within a month. He'll still be able to labor, to use his skills. He'll simply be freed from the compulsions that led him astray." "This ain't right," Jacob said, his voice breaking. "Sir, I'm begging you, send him away. Sell him if you must, but don't do this." Marcus turned from the window, his expression hard. "My decision is final. You will not speak of this to anyone, including James. When Dr. Ashby arrives, you will assist in ensuring James is brought to the location we designate. If you refuse, I'll find another overseer, and you'll be sold along with him. Do you understand?" Jacob nodded, his hands trembling on his hat brim. "Yes, sir. Good. Return to your work." Jacob left the main house and went directly to the forge where James was shaping plowshares. The young man looked up, saw the devastation on his mentor's face, and set down his hammer. "What happened?" Jacob couldn't meet his eyes. "Pack your things tonight, whatever you can carry. There's a conductor 2 counties north near the Presbyterian Church on Old Mill Road. If you leave now, travel only at night, you might reach him before." "Before what?" The old man's silence was answer enough. "I can't run," James said finally. "They'll take it out on everyone here, on you, on my mother, on Sarah and her children. You know they will. Boy, if you stay, what they planning to do?" "I know what they're planning." James's voice was eerily calm. "I've known since Miss Arabella started this whole thing. I've seen it happen before. I heard stories from slaves who came up from the deeper south." He picked up the hammer again, felt its familiar weight. "Running just makes it worse for everyone else. You can't just accept this." "I don't have a choice." James returned to the plowshare, striking the hot iron with methodical precision. "None of us ever did." Dr. Cornelius Ashby arrived at Belmont Hall on a Tuesday morning in late July. He came in a black carriage driven by his assistant, a taciturn man who helped unload several leather cases in a locked wooden chest. Asham himself was in his early 50s, clean-shaven, his manner professional and detached. He had performed various surgical procedures for planters throughout Virginia and North Carolina, including several that required absolute discretion. Marcus Sutherland met him at the door, leading him to a second-floor room that had been prepared for the operation. Clean linens covered a sturdy table. Buckets of water stood ready. Instruments had been boiled according to Ashby's advanced instructions. "The subject is healthy?" Ashby asked, arranging his instruments with practiced efficiency. "Young, strong, no known ailments," Marcus confirmed. "Good. Recovery will be faster. I'll need assistance holding him during the procedure. The pain is considerable. My overseer, Samuel Hicks, and 2 field hands will assist, and you've explained to the subject what will occur." Marcus hesitated. He knows he's being punished. I thought the specific details might cause unnecessary resistance. Ashby shrugged. "Your decision, though I find honesty often produces better cooperation than surprise." He tested the edge of a scalpel against his thumb. "When would you like to proceed?" "This afternoon. I'd prefer to have it done before my wife returns from her visit to the Hendersons." At 2, James Rutledge was summoned to the main house. He walked up from the forge with Jacob Thornhill beside him, both men silent. They entered through the back door, were directed up the servants' stairs to the second floor. Samuel Hicks waited in the hallway outside the prepared room. He was a thick-shouldered man who'd worked as overseer for 3 years, known for efficiency rather than cruelty. He avoided James's eyes. "Go on in," he said gruffly. James entered. Dr. Jure. Ashby stood beside the table, Marcus Sutherland near the window. 2 field hands, James knew by sight, both large men, stood against the wall. "James," Marcus said, his voice formal, "you've been brought here because of your conduct toward Mrs. Sutherland. I've decided on a punishment that will ensure you never transgress in this manner again." James said nothing. His face remained carefully blank. "Dr. Ash will perform a surgical procedure that will remove your ability to act on improper desires. You'll remain valuable as a worker, but you'll be freed from the urges that led you astray." Still, James said nothing. He looked at the table, the instruments, the men positioned to hold him down. He had spent weeks imagining this moment, steeling himself against it, knowing that resistance would only make it worse. "Do you understand?" Marcus demanded. "Yes, sir," James said quietly. "Do you have anything to say?" James met Marcus's eyes then, and for a moment something flickered there. something that made the planter look away first. "No, sir." "Then let's proceed." What followed was conducted with professional efficiency by Ashby, but the humanity of it, the physical and psychological destruction visited upon James Rutledge in that second-floor room, while July sun streamed through the windows, represented everything monstrous about the system that enabled it. The procedure itself took less than 30 minutes. James was held down by the 4 men while Dr. Ash worked with the detached precision of someone who'd performed this operation multiple times before. James bit through a leather strap they'd placed between his teeth, his screams muffled but audible throughout that wing of the house. Sarah heard it in the kitchen below. She gripped the edge of the work and wept silently, while her daughter Ruth held her shoulders. Jacob heard it in the forge. He drove his fist through a window, the glass cutting deep, blood mixing with tears on his face. Rachel Rutledge, working in the laundry, heard her son's muffled agony and collapsed. 2 other women helped her to her quarters, where she lay staring at nothing for 3 days. When it was finished, James lay unconscious on the table, pale and still. Ash bandaged the wounds with professional care, checked vital signs, gave instructions for after hour. "He'll need to remain still for at least a week," he told Marcus. "Infection is the primary risk. Keep the wounds clean. Change bandages twice daily. Lord Dean him for the pain, but sparingly. You don't want him dependent. If fever develops, send for me immediately." He packed his instruments methodically. He should make a full physical recovery. The psychological impact varies by individual. Some become docile, others depressed. A few develop complications that manifest later, but physically, he'll be able to work again within 4 to 6 weeks. Marcus paid Ash along with a generous bonus for discretion. The doctor departed before dinner, his carriage rattling down the drive while James lay broken in the room above. James was moved to a small room off the kitchen where Sarah could tend to his wounds. For the first week, he drifted in and out of consciousness, the Lord-dulling pain that would otherwise have been unbearable. When he was conscious, he stared at the ceiling and said nothing. Rachel came to sit beside him, holding his hand, speaking softly about nothing, trying to bridge a chasm she couldn't cross. James would not meet her eyes. Jacob visited twice, his hand still bandaged from the window glass. He tried to apologize, tried to explain that he'd had no power to prevent what had happened. James listened in silence, then turned his face to the wall. By the second week, infection had been successfully avoided. James's body was healing with the resilience of youth. The physical wounds would close, would leave scars hidden beneath clothing, would become simply another mark among many that told the story of survival under an impossible system, but the psychological wounds went deeper than any scalpel could reach. Arabella Sutherland returned from her visit on the 3rd day after the procedure. Marcus explained what had been done in the privacy of their bedroom, speaking in clinical terms about medical necessity and proper punishment. "You didn't need to go that far," Arabella said quietly, her face pale in the lamplight. "I did what was necessary to protect you," Marcus replied, "to protect our family's reputation. No one will dare question your honor now because everyone will understand the consequences of such behavior. Does everyone know? The essential facts have been shared discreetly with those who matter. Dr. Ashby is known for discretion, but he'll also ensure that certain people understand what was done and why. It serves as warning to others." Arabella nodded slowly. She had wanted James, been refused, and punished him for that refusal through the only means available to her. But standing in her comfortable bedroom, looking at her husband's self-satisfied expression, she felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not guilt, she told herself. She had been wronged, had been put in an impossible position by James's presumption. This was justice, but in the months and years that followed, she would sometimes wake in the night, remembering the young man on the ladder, his careful concentration as he removed a window frame, the way his hands had shaped iron with precision and grace. She would remember her own desire, her own loneliness, her own role in what had followed. These thoughts she pushed away with practiced ease. A lady of her station could not afford such doubts. By the 4th week, James was walking again slowly. The physical pain had faded to a constant dull ache. He returned to light work in the forge, Jacob watching over him with grief-stricken care. James spoke little. He performed his task with mechanical efficiency, showing no emotion, making no complaints. The light that had once animated his face, the subtle pride in his craftsmanship, the quiet dignity that had drawn Arabella's attention, all of it was gone. He moved through his days like a ghost, present in body, absent in every way that mattered. The other slaves watched this transformation with horror and pity. Whispers spread through the quarters about what had been done and why. Some blamed James for attracting attention, for not being more careful. Others blamed Arabella for her cruelty, Marcus for his cowardice, the system itself for making such atrocities possible. But whispers changed nothing. The work continued. The tobacco grew. The harvest came and went. Life at Belmont Hall moved forward with the inexorable momentum of an institution that had perfected the machinery of dehumanization over generations. For 3 years, James Rutledge worked at Belmont Hall's forge, his skill undiminished, even as his spirit remained shattered. He spoke when spoken to, performed his tasks flawlessly, and lived within himself in ways that terrified those who had known him before. Rachel tried to reach him, but he had built walls she couldn't penetrate. Jacob tried to mentor him as before, but the easy camaraderie was gone, replaced by hollow interactions that satisfied form while lacking all substance. In 1850, Jacob Thornhill died of lung disease, his last years haunted by guilt over what he'd been unable to prevent. On his deathbed, he gave James a leather pouch containing $23 he'd saved over decades, along with a letter of introduction to a blacksmith in Philadelphia. "Run," Jacob whispered, his breathing labored. "Head north. You got the skills to earn your way as a free man. Don't die here." James took the pouch but said nothing. He stood at Jacob's grave and did not cry. Marcus Sutherland, meanwhile, continued his role as a progressive planter, speaking at county meetings about humane treatment, while the young man he'd mutilated worked silently in his forge. The cognitive dissonance never seemed to trouble him. He saw himself as a man who'd made difficult but necessary decisions to protect his family and maintain proper social order. Arabella aged into her late 20s, then early 30s, maintaining her role as gracious plantation mistress. She bore Marcus 2 daughters in 1851 and 1854. She poured herself into motherhood and social obligations, staying busy enough that she rarely had time to reflect on the past. But occasionally, in quiet moments, she would see James in the distance, moving between buildings or working at the forge, and something would twist inside her chest. Not quite guilt, not quite regret, something more complicated, something she had no language to express and no desire to examine too closely. The house slaves watched these dynamics with the bitter wisdom of people who understood the true nature of power in this world. They saw how Marcus congratulated himself on his restraint, how Arabella avoided looking at James, how James had been transformed from a person into a warning, a lesson written in flesh and silence. In November of 1852, a fever swept through Greenfield County. It took 10 slaves from Belmont Hall, including Sarah, who had tended James after his mutilation. Before she died, she called James to her bedside. "You're still alive," she whispered, her voice rough. "That means you still got purpose. Don't know what it is, but God don't keep people here for no reason. You remember that?" James held her hand until she died, his face still as stone. In March of 1853, James Rutledge vanished. He had been sent to Harrington's Ford to pick up supplies from the blacksmith shop there. He never returned. His horse came back to Belmont Hall the following morning, the supply sack still strapped to its saddle, but James was gone. Marcus Sutherland immediately dispatched men to search. They combed the town, questioned merchants and travelers, checked the roads for signs of a runaway heading north. They found nothing. Notices were posted in Richmond and Petersburg. Descriptions circulated to slave catchers and sheriffs throughout Virginia and into North Carolina. James Rutledge, age 24, skilled blacksmith, distinctive facial scar above left eyebrow, approximately 5'11" in, muscular build, $200 reward for capture and return. No one ever claimed the reward. Some speculated he drowned in the Nahway River while attempting escape. Others suggested he'd been murdered by white men who saw him unattended in town and decided to eliminate what they saw as an uppity slave. Some whispered that he made it north on the Underground Railroad. The conductors had spirited him away to Philadelphia or Canada, where his skills would let him build a new life. Marcus concluded the matter with typical pragmatism. He purchased another enslaved blacksmith, a man of 40 with none of James's skill but adequate for the plantation's needs. He, Snorts, wrote off James's value in his account books and never mentioned his name again. Arabella said nothing publicly about the disappearance. In private, she asked Marcus twice if he thought James was truly gone. Marcus assured her the matter was closed. She did not ask again. The other slaves of Belmont Hall developed their own theories and stories. Some believed James had planned his escape carefully, waiting for the perfect moment. Others thought he'd simply walked away from a life that had become unbearable, choosing uncertain death over certain degradation. Rachel Rutledge refused to believe her son was dead. For years afterward, she would watch the road at sunset as if James might still come walking up the drive. She never saw him again. For the next 7 years, Belmont Hall continued its operations with mechanical efficiency. The tobacco crop remained profitable. The southern Nederland daughters grew into childhood, learning piano and French and all the accomplishments expected of young ladies in their class. Marcus served on county boards, maintained his reputation as an enlightened planter, accumulated wealth with the ruthless efficiency required by the system. But certain facts could not be entirely buried. In 1857, a young journalist from Richmond spent several weeks traveling through Greenfield County, gathering stories for a series of articles about plantation life. He interviewed numerous planters, including Marcus Sutherland and many enslaved people, in discreet conversations away from their masters' ears. In his notes, never published, he recorded a conversation with an elderly woman named Rachel, who spoke about her son, a skilled blacksmith who had disappeared 4 years earlier. She described his training, his talent, his quiet dignity. Then, her voice dropping to a near whisper, she described what had been done to him in July of 1850. The journalist, horrified, tried to verify the story. He made discreet inquiries, spoke with a doctor in Petersburg who acknowledged that corrective procedures were sometimes performed on enslaved men, though he declined to provide details. He interviewed a lawyer who confirmed that such actions were entirely legal within the absolute power held by masters over their chat property. The journalist titled his unpublished manuscript, "The Machinery of Cruelty: Observations on Slavery in Virginia." In it, he wrote, "What shocked me most was not the existence of such brutality, for I had long known slavery to be brutal in practice, whatever philosophical justifications might be offered. What shocked me was the casualness with which it was discussed by those who enacted it, and the absolute silence imposed upon those who suffered it." James Rutledge's story is not unique. It is merely one small thread in a vast tapestry of horrors, distinguished only by my chance encounter with those willing to speak of it. How many similar stories remain buried? How many similar cruelties enacted in silence? The question haunts me still. The manuscript remained in his papers, never published during his lifetime, discovered only decades after his death by historians researching the period. The Civil War came to Virginia in 1861. Belmont Hall's fortunes fluctuated with the conflict's tide. Marcus Sutherland, too old for military service but not for political maneuvering, attempted to protect his assets through strategic loyalty to whatever power seemed ascendant. The plantation survived war intact, but diminished, its labor force depleted by desertion and death. Arabella Sutherland aged through these years, watching her daughters mature, her husband grow older, their world transform. She developed a reputation for piety, attending church services faithfully, organizing charitable efforts for war widows. Those who knew her described a woman of rigid propriety, generous within the limits of her class, occasionally distant, as if her thoughts occupied some interior space no one else could access. She never spoke of James Rutledge. If she thought of him, she left no record of those thoughts. Marcus Sutherland died in 1867, age 59, from heart disease. His final months were marked by increasing frailty and bitter reflections on a world that had fundamentally changed around him. The Confederacy's defeat had shattered the social order he'd spent his life maintaining, and he struggled to reconcile his self-image as a humane master with the reality of emancipation that suggested his entire worldview had been built on moral quicksand. His will divided the plantation between his daughters, both married by then to men who understood land management in the new economy of Reconstruction. Margaret had married Robert Pembley, a former Confederate officer who'd lost an arm at Chancellorsville, and returned home with a pragmatic understanding that the old ways were finished. Catherine had married Thomas Lockwood, a Richmond merchant son who saw opportunity in the chaos of rebuilding. The formerly enslaved people of Belmont Hall were legally free, but practically bound by the sharecropping arrangements that replaced the formal structures of slavery with only slightly less oppressive economic traps. The legal freedom meant little when land ownership remained concentrated in the hands of former masters, when credit systems kept workers perpetually indebted, when violence and intimidation enforced a racial hierarchy that law had supposedly abolished. Rachel Rutledge, granted her freedom at age 57, remained on the property because she had nowhere else to go. Her skills as a seamstress provided modest income, but age and grief had worn her down. She lived in a small cabin near where the slave quarters had stood, spending her days mending clothes for families both black and white, her evenings watching the road. Other former slaves tried to speak with her about James, to share memories or offer comfort, but Rachel had retreated into a private space of hope and denial that no one could penetrate. She insisted James was alive somewhere in Philadelphia or Boston, working as a respected craftsman, unable to return, but safe. She created elaborate narratives about his new life, describing details with such conviction that some younger people who'd never known James began to believe these stories themselves. In 1869, a man claiming to be James Rutledge appeared briefly in Petersburg. He was the right age, had similar features, worked as a blacksmith. Rachel traveled there with desperate hope, but when she saw him she knew immediately he was not her son. The set of his shoulders was wrong, his hands moved differently. His eyes held none of James's quiet intensity. She returned to Belmont Hall and never mentioned the incident to anyone. She died in 1873 on a warm evening in August. Her neighbor, a woman named Dina, who'd worked alongside Rachel in the Plantation house decades earlier, found her sitting in her chair on the porch, eyes fixed on the road, a slight smile on her face, as if she'd finally seen something she'd been waiting for. Arabella lived until 1891, reaching the age of 69. The years after Marcus's death were marked by increasing isolation and what her family delicately termed nervous troubles. She attended church regularly, but spoke little at social gatherings. Her daughters worried about her long silences, the way she would stare out windows as if searching for something in the distance. She maintained meticulous control over the household even as the estate's fortunes declined. She rejected multiple suitors after becoming a widow, claiming no interest in remarrying. Instead, she poured her energy into raising her grandchildren and managing the increasingly complex finances required to keep what remained of Belmont Hall operational. But certain patterns emerged that troubled her daughters. Arabella refused to allow any metalwork to be done on the property, insisting that all repairs requiring a blacksmith be sent to town. She avoided the area where the forge had stood, which had been partially dismantled after the war. On the rare occasions when she passed near it, witnesses reported that she would quicken her pace and turn her face away as if unable to bear the sight. In her final years, she suffered from what her family called melancholia, spending long hours in her room, speaking little, rarely engaging with her grandchildren or the social world that had once defined her existence. She would sometimes wake in the night screaming, though she never explained the nightmares that plagued her. Her daughters attributed this to the general trauma of having lived through the war, the loss of their father, the difficulties of aging. A year before her death, she asked her daughter Margaret to bring her a locked box from the attic. Inside were letters, documents, and a leather-bound journal Arabella had kept intermittently throughout her marriage. Margaret started to open the journal, curious about her mother's inner thoughts across so many years. But Arabella's hand shot out with surprising strength. "Burn it," Arabella said, her voice but commanding. "Burn everything in this box. Mother, these are your private papers. Shouldn't we preserve them for the family, for history?" "History?" Arabella's laugh was bitter and strange. "History is what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. These should be forgotten." "But Mother Margaret," Arabella gripped her daughter's wrist with trembling fingers. "I have spent 40 years carrying weight you cannot imagine. I will not pass that weight to you. Burn them. Don't read them. Promise me." Margaret, disturbed by the intensity in her mother's eyes, promised. That evening she fed the box's contents to the parlor fireplace without examining them. She watched pages curl and blacken, watched ink run and fade, watched whatever confessions or reflections her mother had written transform into ash. Later she would wonder what truths had been destroyed. She would remember odd comments her mother had made over the years, oblique references to mistakes and consequences, vague allusions to events Margaret had been too young to understand, but she had promised, and the answers were gone. Arabella died in her sleep 3 months later on a cold November morning. The doctor who examined her body noted that her face, usually set in lines of tension even in sleep, looked peaceful. At her funeral, the minister praised her charity, her devotion to family, her grace under the trials of war and Reconstruction. He spoke of her quiet generosity to freed slaves who had worked at Belmont Hall, the small gifts and assistance she'd provided in later years, acts that might have been interpreted as Christian charity, or perhaps something more complicated. No one mentioned the young man whose life she had destroyed. Most of those present had never heard his name. In 1902, a researcher from the Virginia Historical Society spent 3 months in Greenfield County, conducting interviews with elderly residents for a project documenting the antebellum period. Dr. Jim. Howard Chambers was a careful scholar interested in preserving first-hand accounts before the generation that had lived through slavery and Civil War passed away entirely. He spoke with former slaves, children of planters, merchants, doctors, anyone who could provide detailed accounts of life before and during the war. He filled notebook after notebook with descriptions of daily routines, economic systems, social hierarchies, religious practices, family structures. He was trying to create a comprehensive picture of a world that had vanished, leaving only memories and ruins. One of his interviews was with Isaiah Hicks, age 76, son of Samuel Hicks, who had served as overseer at Belmont Hall. Isaiah had moved to Richmond after the war, worked as a clerk, built a modest life separate from his father's occupation. But he remembered the plantation with the clarity that significant childhood experiences often retain. He recounted numerous stories about plantation life, most fairly conventional: the rhythms of planting and harvest, relationships between enslaved families, tensions during the war, the chaos of emancipation. Then near the end of the interview, when Chambers was gathering his materials, Isaiah mentioned something that caught the researcher's attention. There was a slave boy, a blacksmith, Isaiah said, his voice uncertain as if testing whether he should speak further. James, I think his name was James Rutledge. Something terrible happened to him. My father wouldn't talk about it much, wouldn't explain it to me when I was young, but as I got older, I gathered it involved the master's wife and some kind of punishment that he trailed off, his discomfort evident. Chambers set his notebook back down and waited. Silence often produced more than questions. Father said it was the worst thing he'd been part of. Isaiah continued slowly, and he'd been part of plenty of bad things in those days. He knew their whippings, sales that separated families, all the usual cruelties. But this was different. He said this was something that destroyed a man in a way that couldn't be undone. Father said he prayed over it till the day he died. Asked God for forgiveness for something he couldn't refuse to do. What exactly was done? Chambers asked gently. I don't know the details, Father wouldn't say. But I remember once years later there was some talk at church about medical procedures being used on criminals. And Father stood up and said no civilized society should allow such things, that he'd seen what it did to a man. Everyone was surprised because Father wasn't one to speak up in meetings. I asked him about it later and he just said, some sins stay with you, son. Some things you see you can never unsee. Chambers pressed for more details, but Isaiah had little else to offer. The story had been passed down, fragmentary, distorted by time, and his father's reluctance to speak plainly about atrocities. The researcher made extensive notes, attempted to verify the account through county records. He spent 2 weeks in courthouse archives examining ledgers, inventory lists, legal documents. He found James Rutledge's name appearing in Belmont Hall's inventory through March 1847, valued at $1,200 with notation of his skills as a blacksmith's apprentice. Then the cryptic entry in November 1849, disposed of by arrangement, medical necessity, then nothing. He located no trial records, no sale documents, no death certificate. He found no evidence James had been sold to another plantation or moved to Richmond or Petersburg. The young man had simply been erased from official history with the efficiency that characterized how the slave system dealt with inconvenient truths. Chambers interviewed 3 elderly black residents who had been enslaved at Belmont Hall. 2 claimed no knowledge of James Rutledge, their faces closing in the way that suggested they knew more than they would say to a white researcher. The third, a woman named Elizabeth who had been a child during the period in question, was more forthcoming. I remember him, she said quietly. Pretty boy, good worker, kept to himself mostly. Then something happened with the mistress. Nobody would say exactly what, and he got punished bad, real bad. Came back different, walked like he was carrying something heavy nobody else could see. Then one day he was gone and we were told not to ask about him. His mama never got over it. Died still waiting for him to come home. Do you know what the punishment was? Chambers asked. Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment, then shook her head. Some things ain't meant to be said out loud, but it was the kind of thing that makes a man wish he'd died instead of lived. Chambers attempted to locate Dr. Cornelius Ashby, who he discovered had visited Belmont Hall around the relevant time period. He learned that Ashby died in 1876. His personal papers destroyed in a fire that had also claimed his medical practice. Convenient Chambers noted how documents related to such matters tended to disappear. In his published work, Voices of Antebellum, Virginia, released in 1905, the researcher included a section about punishments enacted upon enslaved persons. It was carefully written to avoid explicit details that might offend contemporary readers, but it acknowledged that certain forms of physical punishment were enacted that permanently altered the bodies and spirits of those subjected to them, though specific documentation often does not survive due to deliberate destruction of evidence. In a footnote about James's case, he wrote, "The case of James Rutledge represents one of many where justice was never sought and truth was deliberately obscured. What fragmentary evidence survives suggests an atrocity enacted not in a moment of rage, but as calculated punishment, carried out with medical precision and legal sanction. That such acts were possible within the framework of civilized society speaks to the fundamental corruption of any system that treats human beings as property subject to absolute control." The footnote appeared on page 347 of a dense academic text that received modest scholarly attention but little popular readership. Few people read it. Fewer still understood its full implications. Today, Belmont Hall stands in ruins. The main house burned in a mysterious fire in 1923 during a period of labor unrest when sharecrows were organizing against the descendants of former plantation owners. No one was ever charged with arson, but local legend held that the fire had been deliberately set as a symbolic rejection of the past. The flames consumed most of the structure, leaving only portions of the foundation and a few scattered outbuildings. The land was subdivided and sold throughout the 1930s and 1940s. A portion became a small tobacco farm operated by a black family who'd managed to purchase their own land during Reconstruction. Another section was sold to developers in the 1950s. By 1970, a state highway cut through what had once been tobacco fields, dividing the property forever. The forge, where James learned his trade, collapsed sometime in the early 20th century. Local residents used its stones to build other structures, scattering the physical remains of the place where a young man had developed skills that should have granted him respect, but instead contributed to his destruction. No marker indicates where it once stood. A historical marker was erected at the intersection near the old property entrance in 1986, part of a statewide initiative to document significant plantation sites. It mentions the Southern family's economic importance, the plantation's role in regional tobacco production, its occupation by Union forces briefly in 865. The text was approved by a committee that included descendants of both enslaved and enslaving families, each group pushing for their preferred narrative. The marker does not mention James Rutledge. His name appears nowhere on the sign in the accompanying brochure or in the tourist information provided by the County Historical Society. He remains absent from the official story as he was intended to be. In 1968, during research for a doctoral dissertation on slave resistance in Virginia, a graduate student named Patricia Mohouse found a curious document in the basement archives of a Petersburg law firm being demolished to make way for a parking garage. It was a letter from Dr. Cornelius Ashby to Marcus Sutherland, dated August 1850, discussing payment for services rendered and expressing professional satisfaction at the successful outcome of the corrective procedure performed in July. The letter went on to provide follow-up medical advice and mentioned that Ashby had performed similar operations on 4 other occasions for clients throughout Virginia and North Carolina, always with satisfactory results. He noted that discretion was paramount in such matters, that documentation should be minimal, and that he trusted Sutherland would destroy the letter after reading it. Sutherland had not destroyed it. Perhaps he'd filed it away and forgotten it. Or perhaps he'd kept it deliberately as protection should questions ever arise. Either way, it survived when so many other documents had been carefully eliminated. Mohouse was horrified by the implications. She attempted to trace the other cases Ashby had mentioned, but found only dead ends. Records that should have existed were missing. Families that should have had documentation claimed their archives had been lost to fire, flood, or simple neglect. The systematic destruction of evidence suggested coordination, a shared understanding among the planter class that certain truths must never become public. The letter was donated to the Virginia Historical Society, where it remains in their collections filed under Slavery Medical Aspects Correspondence. It's available to researchers who know to look for it, who understand the significance of vague phrases like corrective procedure and services rendered. Most researchers focusing on broader economic or political aspects of slavery never encounter it. In 2003, a genealogist named Dr. Ellen Forrester was hired by a Sutherland descendant to research the family history for a reunion. She uncovered Rachel Rutledge's name in plantation records and, intrigued by the notation about her son, began trying to trace his fate. She believed at first it would be a straightforward genealogical exercise, perhaps leading to descendants who might be interested in connecting with the Sutherland family. As part of a broader reconciliation effort some families were attempting, the trail led through fragmentary documentation, conflicting accounts, and long silences. She found Isaiah Hicks's interview in Dr. Chambers' papers. She located Aspie's letter. She discovered Rachel's death certificate and the sad note that she died waiting for her son's return. She interviewed elderly residents of Greenfield County, whose grandparents had been enslaved at Belmont Hall, though most knew the story only as vague warnings passed down about the dangers of attracting white women's attention. Dr. Forrester concluded that James Rutledge most likely died attempting to escape sometime in 1853, though she acknowledged that no concrete evidence supported this theory. It was simply the most logical explanation for a young man who had every reason to risk death, rather than continue living with what had been done to him. But she also discovered something that complicated her conclusion. Several Rutledge families in Philadelphia in the 1860s included blacksmiths, and one included a man named James who was approximately the right age. The documentation was sparse and contradictory. The James in Philadelphia was listed as having been born free in Delaware in some records, as having escaped from North Carolina in others. His age was given variously as anywhere from 28 to 35 in different census records. Most frustratingly, she found a photograph from a Philadelphia Metal Workers Guild publication in 1871, showing a group of craftsmen at a convention. The caption listed names, including a James Rutledge. The photograph was poor quality, faces blurred by the long exposure time required, but one figure seemed to match what she knew of James's physical description. But dates didn't quite align. Ages were uncertain, and the Civil War had disrupted record-keeping throughout the region. People reinvented themselves in those chaotic years, claimed new identities, obscured painful pasts. It was impossible to say definitively whether this James was the same person who had vanished from Greenfield County. Dr. Turper. Forrester included a section in her research report that she titled "The Weight of Silence." She wrote, "We may never know what became of James Rutledge. His story represents thousands of untold stories, thousands of lives brutally interrupted by a system that treated human beings as property to be used, modified, or destroyed at will. The absence of documentation is itself documentation of a sort, evidence of how thoroughly certain truths were suppressed. What we do know is that whether James died in Virginia or lived to find freedom in the North, his story reveals the intimate terror at the heart of slavery. This was not merely economic exploitation or political oppression, though it was those things. It was also a system that granted some human beings absolute power over the bodies and souls of others, with consequences that echo through generations. The Sutherland family story, like so many plantation families, includes both victims and perpetrators. The descendants I've interviewed carry no personal guilt for what their ancestors did, but they do carry a responsibility to acknowledge the truth. That acknowledgement begins with speaking James Rutledge's name with refusing to let him remain erased from history. The Sutherland descendants who commissioned the research were divided on how to respond. Some wanted to publicize the findings to create a memorial to contribute to organizations working on truth and reconciliation efforts. Others wanted to keep the information private, arguing that it would only cause pain without changing the past. The family remains divided on this question today. What do we really know about James Rutledge? We know he existed, that he was born enslaved on a Virginia plantation in 1829. We know he showed exceptional skill as a blacksmith. We know that in the summer of 1850, at the age of 18, he became the target of his mistress's desire and his master's brutal response to that desire. We know that he survived the procedure that was meant to break him. We know that he vanished 3 years later. Everything else is fragments, whispers, theories built on the ruins of deliberately destroyed evidence. The historical record is full of such gaps, places where human suffering was carefully edited out of the official narrative, where crimes against enslaved people were committed with the full protection of law and social sanction. James Rutledge's story matters not because it's unique, but because it isn't. For every case where we have fragmentary documentation, dozens more occurred in complete silence. For every atrocity whispered about in footnotes, dozens more were buried so thoroughly that no trace remains. The machinery of slavery was designed to be efficient in its cruelty, effective in its obliteration of humanity, and self-protecting in its destruction of evidence. It succeeded beyond measure. How many names were erased? How many stories lost? How many people transformed from human beings into warnings? Lessons written in flesh and forgotten by design. We don't know. We can never know. We can only acknowledge the weight of that silence and honor the memory of those whose stories were deliberately destroyed. The land where Belmont Hall once stood is quiet now. Grass grows over foundations. Trees shade what were once tobacco fields. Cars speed past on the highway, drivers unaware of the history beneath the asphalt. But if history has taught us anything, it's that silence does not equal absence. That buried truth still shape the present, that the weight of the past can never be fully escaped until it's finally acknowledged. James Rutledge deserves to be remembered not as a victim whose suffering serves as spectacle, but as a human being whose life had value, whose skills had worth, whose dignity was never truly destroyed, no matter what was done to his body. His name should be spoken, his story should be told. The system that enabled his destruction should be understood in all its brutal clarity. Only then can we begin to reckon with what America was built upon. And only then can we begin to build something better. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything has been revealed, or does the truth remain buried in Virginia soil? Leave your comment below. If you appreciated this difficult but important historical account, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and hit the notification bell so you never miss these forgotten chapters of American history. Share this video with someone who understands that confronting our darkest past is the only way to truly move forward. Thank you for bearing witness to James Rutledge's story. May we never forget.